We're very happy this evening here at Books and Books to welcome Mr. Phillippe, Diederich, and Sofrito. Born in the Dominican Republic, Mr. Diederich was raised in Mexico City and Miami. His parents were kicked out of Haiti by the dictatorship of Papa Doc Duvalier in 1963. He spent his youth listening to his parents and friends talking politics and nostalgically dreaming of the day they would return to Haiti. In 1980, the family moved to Miami, where they joined a community of exiles, all from parts of Latin America. Diederich traveled repeatedly to Cuba as a photojournalist throughout the 1990s. He has an MFA in creative writing from the University of South Florida and lives in Florida. This is his first novel. Please give him a nice warm welcome, Mr. Frederick Diederich.
Oh, shucks. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everyone, for coming, especially my family. So I'm going to read from Sofrito, and for those who have not read the story, the book is about the son of Cuban exiles who goes back to Cuba to try to retrieve a recipe in order to save his restaurant in New York City, which is not doing very well. And while that's the main plot of the story, he also discovers the Cuban in him while he's down there. He also falls in love and discovers the truth about his father's past, which was not quite hidden to him, but he didn't know. So I like to read two different sections. And the first section has to do with the subplots, for the most part with the idea of him falling in love. He has met, in his first night, he met a jinetera, a literature student who is moonlighting as a prostitute, and they went out to dinner to the restaurant where the recipe exists, and they spend the night together. He has just found out that the person that was supposed to help him get the recipe is not going to help him with the recipe. And so he's not sure what he's going to do, but he goes back to her apartment. Her name is Marisol, and she lives with a couple of roommates. So this part has to do with that sort of section of the plot where they begin to bond. The taxi sped along the Malecón. After they passed the Hotel Nacional, Marisol leaned forward and pointed out the building for the driver. It's the blue one at the curve, before the Deauville. Frank glanced out the window. Your apartment overlooks the ocean? Please, it's not as glamorous as you think. You can't imagine what that would cost in the States. Yes, Frank, but this is Cuba. They had taken a taxi from Eusebios and driven along the Malecón to Marisol's apartment. At the front step of the building, an old lady holding 3 packs of Popular cigarettes raised an eyebrow at Marisol. Niña. Marisol nodded. Señora Peña. ¿Y él? Does he want any cigarettes? No, mami, gracias. She led Frank up the broken marble stairs. The building was textured by years of neglect. Exposed, tangled wires hung from rusted nails and ran along the length of the crumbling walls. In another life, it had been something exclusive. They reached the 3rd floor. Marisol banged on the large wooden door. Eulina, Jocelyn, coño. Marisol, the neighbor poked her head around the hallway. Mira, el chino came by. He says he has shampoo for $2, like for a big bottle like this. I told him to come back. He might want to trade. And who's this? Italiano. Yuma, Marisol said proudly. Yuma, really? The neighbor smiled at Frank. Have you seen Eulina? Marisol asked. She's in there, but she's scared. That hijo de puta Chuck Norris came by last night and scared her half to death. Eulina, open the door, it's Marisol. Finally, the bolt turned and the door opened. Eulina's eyes were bloodshot. Marisol caressed her cheek. Dios mío, niña, what happened? When I came home last night, Chuck Norris was waiting for one of us. He grabbed me by the neck and told me he knew what we were up to and that we were going to be arrested for peligrosidad and that we were a bunch of dirty putas. Hijo de puta, he has no right to do this to you. Are you okay? Uh-huh. Did he do anything else? No, he just pushed me against the wall. I hit the side of my head, then he left. Frank touched Marisol's shoulder. Who's Chuck Norris? He's a plainclothes policeman in charge of the neighborhood. He's a short guy with a bad attitude who's always beating up on everyone. Last month, he beat my neighbor's 12-year-old son for selling avocados in the street. Eulina glanced at Frank. Italiano? Americano. Really? Miami? New York? Americano, she smiled. I have 2 brothers in Miami. Frank laughed. I'm not surprised. They took a raft in 94. Eulina turned to Marisol. By the way, a chino came by. He says he has shampoo. Serenita told me. And La Vieja from next door has garlic and onions. How much does she want for the garlic? 3 pesos. She didn't say about the onions. Y nada de Jocelyn? Not since I saw her dance away with an Italiano. Mira, Marisol handed Eulina $5. If the chino comes back, get some shampoo, okay? Frank followed Marisol into her bedroom. It was small and cramped with a single bed, a plain wooden night table, and a tall antique mahogany dresser that had no doors. The walls were flaking with old paint and the ceiling was covered in brown spots. A large frameless mirror with a long crack rested against the wall by the door. On the dresser, there were a couple of perfume bottles, a small stuffed animal, and a dozen tattered books. A poster of Che Guevara from the famous Gorda photograph looked over the room. I'm not much of a communist, she said, but you can't deny he's handsome. Maybe one day I can get a poster of Brad Pitt or Enrique Iglesias. I didn't say anything, but I saw you looking. You're in exile, Frank. I know how you think. I'm not in exile. He had never longed for Cuba. To him, Cuba was a word spoken in occasional newscasts. It was violence, and it was that eerie quiet that surrounded his childhood home. Marisol opened a pair of large wooden shutters. Frank stepped onto the balcony and looked out toward the ocean across the avenue. The sun was low on his left, far in the distance past the ocean behind Miramar. To his right, he could see the Moro Castle turning pink. A soft breeze carrying the scent of the Cuban childhood he did not have came and went in the subtle waves that left him wondering if it was real, if he had truly smelled it. He rested his hands on the wrought iron rail that had been rusted and shaped by 100 years of salt and wind. The texture of the wall, the exposed cement and stone of the building, bare under a wash of blue like the part of the sky that was closest to the sun, framed the view that had become a simple memory for thousands of broken-hearted exiles. His stomach twisted and his throat itched with a heavy melancholy he did not understand. Quizá, he whispered, without turning from the view that had captured his defenseless nostalgia. In a way, maybe I am in exile. Marisol stepped behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist. She rested the side of her face against the back of his shoulder. Maybe, she said softly, we're all exiles in our own way. He didn't know what she meant by it, but in her eyes he recognized his own sadness, a quiet, simmering melancholy he always thought he'd been born with. In all the family photographs, he never smiled. He thought perhaps she felt oppressed, lost, and yet he didn't feel she would be better off in Miami or Spain. If she accepted the simplicity of Cuba, she could be happy. But that was naive of him. Maybe she was happy. He knew nothing of her life. Besides, he was focusing on the wrong thing. He was here for the recipe. He had to find another way to get it. They stayed that way for a long time, absorbing the sounds of Havana that swept in gusts, the broken exhaust of cars, and the pedaling of flying pigeon bicycles buzzing like insects below the window. The sky slowly turned to fire, covering Havana in gold dust. A group of children marched on top of the seawall in a broken line. Couples held hands as they walked past. From somewhere, the sound of a lone trumpet playing the morose notes of a bolero pierced through the tepid evening. So Frank befriends Marisol for the week that he's in Havana searching for this recipe. And together they explore the city. And slowly it comes together that Frank might be able to get this recipe to save his restaurant in New York. And one of the things that he figures out is that the recipe is divided by the different chefs, different cooks at the restaurant. And one of the chefs is a gay cross-dresser who performs at a clandestine gay bar in downtown in Havana. And so he makes this plan to photograph this person during a sex act with a male prostitute that he's hired so that he can then blackmail this guy to give him the recipe. So in this scene, which is more directly towards the main plot of the story, Frank has been to a party where the guy that's helping him get the recipe has directed him to hire this male prostitute named Jabal and go to this place called La Casa de Lola and have this male prostitute engage this cross-dresser in an act so that he can take a picture and blackmail him. So they have just left the party. They drove up Paseo, around and behind the Plaza de la Revolución, the towering Martí monument, looking down on the parched white Cadillac as it turned down Boyeros, and came to a stop at the corner of 19 de Mayo. I have a theory, Jabal said as they left the car and walked down the dark, empty street. I think all Cubans are homosexuals. I think that's the reason why they're so afraid of homosexuals. You know what your problem is, Frank said? You either think everyone is gay or anti-gay. There's no in between. Jabal pointed to an official-looking concrete building behind tall walls. Those are the offices of the central government, you know, where Fidel does whatever it is he does. Over there is Minint, where they torture homosexuals and dissidents. And over here, he turned into a narrow alley where a group of men and women were crowding a doorway, is where Havana's most decadent gays do their thing. Bibi, Charlie screamed and ran ahead of them. La Casa de Lola, I love it. Frank paid the cover and followed Jabal down the set of narrow stairs that led to a large basement-like space lit by red, blue, and black lights. It was a long, narrow bar, a few steps above a large dance floor. Burgundy velvet drapes hung from the ceiling, giving the club the atmosphere of a European cabaret from the 1920s. Techno music blasted out of speakers. The dance floor was full of half-naked men and women moving like a single person, up, down, to the rhythm of the music. By the way, Jabal yelled over the music, just so you know, all the women here are men. They made their way to the bar on the far side of the dance floor and lost Charlie to the crowd. Frank gave Jabal money for the drinks. Then he leaned back against the bar and scanned the dance floor for someone who might fit Veronica's description. All eyes seemed to be on Jabal. Do you see her? Jabal handed Frank a glass with rum and a dash of Coke. No, not yet. Jabal took a long sip of his drink and smiled. This is how I imagine heaven is like. Doesn't that go against the Bible? Frank said. It doesn't matter. Jesus was gay. Coño, to you everyone is gay. Jabal laughed. It's the truth. What about Fidel? Of course. And Che too. The revolution was all a big love triangle. Che and Fidel were in love. Then Camilo showed up, and Che had a thing with him. When Fidel found out, he became furiously jealous and had them both killed. Crimes of passion. Te digo, Fidel es candela. Jabal laughed and moved his body to the rhythm of the music. Do you ever go to bars like this, Frank? No. I can imagine the bars you go to. Everyone looking very proper, showing off their money, talking on their cellular phones, drinking martinis and all that pretentious mierda. You exaggerate. But it annoyed him because it was true. In the States, everything was dressed up and labeled. Cuba, on the other hand, was naked. Jabal's eyes narrowed. Tell me, how did you meet that mulatica of yours? At my hotel. Was it easy? Well, yes, but I had no intention. Come on, Frank. Jabal spread his arms. I know the game. You have a wife back in Miami, and you're here having an affair with a mulata who is everything your wife is not. And you have nothing to worry about because this will never get back to her. Coño, I experienced the same thing, only from the other side. I receive the tourists who come to La Habana to live out their fantasies. Most of them are in the closet, even married. Emotions are not a part of life here. In Cuba, there is no love, only sex. Frank crossed his arms over his chest and looked away. That's your opinion. Please, don't tell me you're in love with her. Jabal's words were like a hammer to the back of his head. He saw Marisol lying on her bed, the sun caressing her skin, and her dark eyes looking at him with complete sincerity, exposing everything, like Havana without all the gloss of the hotels and the restaurants. Look at Charlie, Jabal said. The Canadians are going to have a party with him. They'll screw him until his culo turns purple. He's going to make a killing in Varadero when he goes out strutting that tight, sexy body on the beach. But love? No, Chico. He'll never find it here. You can't speak for everyone. Yes, I can. I know what I'm talking about. Here, love is a figure of speech, not a feeling. Coño, Frank, you can't love if you expect to survive. Frank pointed at him with his glass. You're a pessimist. What would happen if that mulatica fell in love with you? Frank turned away. He hadn't thought of that. When you go home to your country, you will break her heart. After that, it becomes harder for her to fall in love again. Then she meets another one, because you know she will. And if she falls in love and loses him, she'll become more cynical, more professional. Pretty soon, her heart will turn to stone. Frank stared at the ice floating in his glass. He was angry with himself. He had not considered her feelings or her future. He had only focused on Maduros and the recipe. He was angry for how he had treated her, for abandoning her at the party, for not saying anything, for not being honest even with her, with himself. The music stopped, and a deep voice broke in. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas todo el mundo. The lights dimmed, and the bright spot isolated a robust woman at the corner of the club. As people walked off the dance floor, she walked to the center, the tail of her long yellow gown dragging on the floor behind her. Yes, we have a fantastic lineup for you this evening, as we do each and every Thursday night here at La Casa de Lola. We will be graced with some wonderful singing and acting. There was a brief applause. Someone yelled something. The woman at the center of the dance floor raised her hand. Please, let's begin tonight, like we do every Thursday, with a fine performance by our talented and very dear friend, Veronica. So let's hear it for the sultry lady in red, who will be performing an old classic by the great late Mexican singing star, Chelo Silva. Ladies, Veronica. An older, slightly heavyset transvestite wearing a red dress and shoulder-length blonde hair stepped out from behind her curtain. Habao winced. What a hideous dress. The music started, a light tropical beat, almost a danzón, and the high-pitched scratch of an old vinyl record. Veronica bowed and looked at the ground. In a deep, masculine voice, she said, como un perro. Then she began to sway her body to the rhythm of the music. She slowly brought the microphone to her mouth and began moving her lips to the words as Chelo Silva sang, Por tener la miel amarga de tus besos. When she finished, the crowd gave her a generous applause. She made a flamboyant curtsy and strutted proudly off the dance floor. The next number was introduced, and the crowd roared as a dance troupe from Baracoa took the floor, 4 black men wearing G-strings, their bodies glazed with Vaseline, moving to the frantic rhythms of congas. Habao stared and moved his torso to the beat. Frank set his drink down and nudged Habao with his elbow. Come on. Habao twisted with the music. They're fabulous, no? Let's get to work. They walked across the club. Habao took Frank by the arm. Go to the bathroom over there. I'll take her into the stall. We'll do it in there. You want some money? Por favor, he laughed. It's her privilege. The bathroom was small and stank of shit and urine and mildew. There were 4 toilet stalls on one side and a line of urinals on the other. 2 men stood by the sink, going through the motions of an arcane transaction. Another man leaned against the wall, writing something over a urinal. Frank walked to the urinal farthest from their entrance. A moment later, the door flew open and Habao marched in with Veronica tagging behind. Habao kicked open the stall and pulled her in. Frank heard the unzipping, Veronica's giggling, and some vague comments about Habao's size. The drumming went on, fast. Frank's hands trembled as he pulled the camera out of his pocket and turned it on. The flash made a whizzing sound as it charged. The orange radio light blinked. He moved toward the stall, his knees weak. He took a deep breath and pulled the stall door open. Ba-ba-bum. I'll leave that for you guys to read the rest. Thank you. So I'll be happy to answer any questions else you might have? Yes, sir.
I read in your bio, this is your first novel.
Yes, sir.
So tell me about that, sort of developing this as your first full-length work of fiction.
It was hell. Yeah, actually, the book takes place in the. I spent a lot of time in the '90s traveling to Cuba as a photojournalist. Lynn Slatke over there went with me one time, and so for some reason, I just had this nostalgia about all that time in the streets, and I wanted to write a story that took place in Cuba. And in 2000, 2001, 2002, I pretty much wrote the first draft, but it sucked. I mean, it's a first attempt, and it just wasn't very good. So it took a few years of revising and sending it out and getting it rejected and getting a little feedback. I wasn't sure where to go to try to learn to write quickly. And so it was a process, and there was a lot of rejection, a lot of revision, and it took a long time. So if I finished maybe what would have been the first draft sometime in 2001 or 2002, and it just got published, so the journey was a long one. So yeah, but once the story was there, it was kind of figuring out what it was that I was doing wrong, like those issues with point of views and issues with too much description, perhaps, redundancies. So learning all that, how to trim, is very difficult, and so that took a long time. You don't want to kill your darlings, as they say. So it took a while to have that courage.
Did the book come from the trips that you went to Cuba, or did it present itself as an afterthought of being there?
Well, it's a combination of things. I had been trying to write short stories, and that was not working out for me. I didn't know how to craft a short story, and I had written 2 very bad manuscripts that had no story. I had a friend who was a writer look at one. He said that the problem is that there's no story here. There's good writing, but there's no story. And so what ended up happening, a series of things happened around that time at the end of the '90s, is that I did what was basically my last trip to Cuba. And then I have a friend, Cuban American, his parents are exiles, and we used to always joke around when I would do my trips to Cuba. I would go to his house, we'd go out and party, and I'd see his dad, and his dad was always, you're going to Cuba, Fidel, I said, yeah, no, Fidel's great, we had lobster, I just bug him, and he would be like, when we joke around. And so one day, I don't know what we got into, some kind of a discussion, and he ended up sitting down with us, with my friend and I and his wife, and he gave us this whole story about his experience of the exile, which I had heard before from Cuban exiles, but it was a little bit different, about the university, and he knew a lot of the people that were involved, et cetera. So, but the weird thing was that when we were done, and my friend and I got in a car and went down to Coconut Grove, he said, wow, I didn't know that about my parents. And so that was really the key to Frank's story, because my parents, you can shut them up about hating, that was a conversation at all the dinner tables. It was annoying as hell. It's always, Duvalier, da-da-da-da-da-da. So it was weird for me that he had lived his life without knowing his parents' story of when they were young and at the time of the revolution. So that was a big thing. And then that I wanted to set it up in Cuba at the time, not a lot of people were traveling there from the States, and so I thought that would be an exotic location to do something. And it was very alive in my head with my experiences in the streets and the people that I was hanging out with there. And then the other thing that happened that came with the idea of the recipe is that I thought, well, somebody has to go to Cuba. Where are they going to Cuba? What's the deal? And at the time, I was beginning to nest. I had my first house, and I was going to get married, and I started cooking. And all the cooking shows on TV were sort of starting at that time in the late '90s, early 2000s, Rachel Ray and whatnot. So I said, oh, there's an idea, so these guys have a restaurant. So all these 3 things kind of came together. But I can't say that everything was lined up 100% to write the story. It was more to start writing it thinking, oh, he's going to go to get a recipe. And then all these little idiosyncrasies started coming together. So it's in the process of writing. Yes, sir.
How did you choose for his restaurant to be in New York as opposed to Miami? Miami was your launch point for all your travels.
Uh-huh. Well, because what happens is, in the book, his father wants to get as far away from Cuba as he can, so they move to Houston because of the weather. And so he doesn't really grow up, or he couldn't grow up around a community of exiles because then he would know everything. So he had to be sort of isolated. And part of the whole metaphor of the book is that the restaurant that they opened in New York with his brother and their chef is sort of a fusion cuisine, modern, very slick restaurant. And so it had its high point when it opened and when it's trendy for a couple of years, and now that's why it's taken a nosedive. It was because the food, like its time had passed, so they have to reinvent the restaurant. And part of the deal is that the recipe that they get is, that they're after is kind of getting down to the basics, to finding the roots, just like he finds his roots in Cuba. So he couldn't really be in Miami or a lot of that. Why not just open another Cuban restaurant or change it in that way? You had a question.
Yes. What made you become a writer from being a photojournalist? What gave you that beginning of a desire to write? We have a writer in the family.
Well, I'm sorry. My dad was a journalist. Was a journalist. He's a writer, and so I grew up around books and the writing and writers and conversations about writing and the adventures. And what happens is, I think I was scared to become a writer. I think I might have done photojournalism because I was scared of getting things wrong when you write. And so also, Hemingway didn't go to college, so I didn't have to go to college to learn how to write. I was wrong about that, but I thought that maybe I could do it, and that's why it kind of took me a long way around. But I also think that being a photojournalist kind of puts you in the front and around and takes you to places and sort of created this possibility to be in the ground in places and to meet people and have certain experiences. And I think that I wanted that without really knowing that I wanted that. And I also really liked photography. So all the writing that I did in the 80s and 90s when I was a student for photography and when I was a photojournalist was kind of in the closet. But I had the good fortune of hanging out around writers and, talking to them about things without them knowing that I was writing. It's like, so how do you do that? How do you do this? How do you do that? And so I learned a lot from them. And I wasn't sure, that the writing life always seemed more glamorous than it is, I guess. I would read these stories about the writers in the 50s and the 40s and, what a great life, Let's go hang out this season in the south of France and write, with the kids, and then, we'll come back. So so there was a combination of a lot of things. But I also liked reading, and I got very big into reading in the late 80s when I was in photo school. Not having a television really helped. And
How many hours do you write? Like, for example, running this book a day. How much time do you dedicate to it?
it's evolved. Sofrito was written kind of like in long spurts that I would sit and I would write for long periods of time. I had an idea where the story was going, and once the characters kind of take over the story, you just kind of just go because you're like, wow, this is happening. These guys are doing this, they're doing that. But so then there was another period where after this book was written, I was writing all the time. And then now I have more of a momentum of about 3 or 4 hours in the morning.
Coming up with another book soon?
Actually, it's funny that you asked that. The new book is called Playing for the Devil's Fire. You can write that down. And it's coming out. Its release date is on the 15th of March. And I just got an email from the publisher that it's back from the printers, which means it should be shipping next week. So if everything goes good, thank you. Oh, so yeah, and the story's about they're marketing it as a young adult novel, but it really wasn't written as a young adult novel. It's but the protagonist is 12 going on 13, and it takes place in a small town in Mexico where narcos move into this town after a highway is built nearby, and things start happening in the town, and the kid's parents disappear, and he is trying to find his parents, and his journey to try to figure that out, and the corruption that's happening is very much what's happening in Mexico.
So your novel was set during a periodo especial in Cuba. Does that inform the story?
No, it's sort of like right after or coming out of the periodo especial. I guess the high period of the periodo especial was 94, 95. And so this takes place around in 99, pretty much. It's after the Pope's visit, John Paul II, and still Clinton's tenure. And the time itself is a little bit abstract, but it is, that's when I wrote it. And that was one of the issues that I had when the publisher was interested in the book. I said, well, do you need me to update it? Because then the puzzle has a lot to do with when people are born and their ages, and it wasn't going to make sense to make it in the present time, because then Frank would have to be in his, would have to be going on 50, and it would kind of not be good for him to be meeting a 22-year-old Quinetera, and then it just kind of gets a whole other story. So, yeah.
So what restaurant in Cuba is the recipe from? Is that El Ajibe?
Yes. And so that's another thing that informed the book, was that in 98, when the Pope went, I went with some journalists I had never been there before, and they said, oh, we're going to meet at El Ajibe, and somebody mentioned the secret recipe, and I was like, huh. And so that stayed in my mind, didn't think anything of it. It was great, fine. And then, and so later on, as these things developed, it was like, oh yeah, secret recipe. Yeah. Kentucky Fried Chicken has a secret recipe too. But yeah, no, it's a good place. And on their website, they talk about the secret recipe and all that. So, yeah. Anybody else? Thane, you have any questions? My son doesn't have any questions. Are you going to be a writer when you grow up? Good man.
What's worse, a photographer or a writer?
Exactly. Or both, even worse. Yeah, that would be
Well, you're
bad.
always a photographer.
Yeah, if you have a camera. Yeah. Although, my wife is the one that takes pictures of the family now. Like, even with the phone, I'm like, oh, I gotta take a picture. So, yeah.
You can tell, though, reading the book, that you were a photographer, because it's very visual, the book,
Yeah.
and the descriptions are really accurate.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's weird because when I write, I see that. Like if I was describing this room, I would see this room and I would make my choices about what I'm going to say. So it was the same thing. I think that nostalgia for the streets of Havana, that I walked so many times carrying all those cameras and trying to take pictures in the heat and all that stuff, it was those streets and all these things. Like the Chuck Norris character was somebody at a place where I was one time that they called the secret police guy Chuck Norris, and they come out of the streets of Havana. But yeah, I see. It's weird when I'm writing, I actually envision what I'm writing about or what I'm seeing, which makes it really hard to write the internal stuff because you can't see that, and it's like, oh, God, I got to figure out what this guy's thinking and give some feelings and all that. That is hard. Something had to be hard, right?
So what do you think you'll be writing about next? Are you finished with Cuba, or is it?
I don't know. I got to go back.
Yeah, I think Frank has to go back.
Yeah, people are asking me for the sequel, and I don't know. Like, he can't go back in the present. That would be like 10 years, 15 years later. So I don't know. But I just finished something that I sent to my agent that I'm hope goes well, and that'll be a while before I find out what's going on with that. But I don't know. Anything's possible.
Will you allow it to be in a movie?
Oh yeah, sure. You want to make it? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Do you guys want me to sing? You don't want me to sing. Yeah. Well,
But I have to say, having traveled to Cuba many times, you really captured the whole flavor. It was amazing.
oh, thanks.
And it was just an easy read, great story.
Thanks.
You have to bring Frank back.
Well, I'm thinking about it. I have some ideas. I just don't know.
Maybe Obama in the market.
Right. Right. He's the guy that brokered the deal.
Yeah.
Yeah. We'll see what happens.
In a
Yeah.
restaurant in New York.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe Trump wants to buy the restaurant.
There you go. Everything's changing. Yeah. Well, thanks a lot, guys. Thank you, Steve.
Folks, we have the books for sale behind the counter. Mr. Diederich will be signing them for you right over here. If you're still watching online, give us a call. We'll get a book signed for you. Can we get another round of applause for our author? That was a very wonderful.